Hello everyone and welcome. I don't have my own official intro yet, so for the time being I am stealing from the one and only apostate prophet. I'm really sorry about that. For those who don't know, my name is Aisha Muhammad, or you might recognize me as Infidel Noodle from platforms like TikTok and Twitter. I am a former Sunni Muslim and I spent about 20 years of my life believing in and following the teachings of Islam. I guess today I want to go over some of the reasons why I decided to leave Islam and why I decided to speak about that and publicly identify myself as an ex-Muslim. So for many years of my life, I grappled with my belief in Islam. I was genuinely convinced for a very, very long time that I was cursed or deficient or fundamentally flawed in some way because I did struggle with many Islamic teachings. For example, even as a child, it was very easy for me to identify that the marriage between a man in his 50s and a child was morally wrong. Now, this is of course not the sole reason why I left Islam, but as a child, this was something that even from a very early point stood out to me as being questionable. I also questioned other things, like why Allah was so obsessed with me marrying a Muslim man when he had given men the right to marry Christian and Jewish women. I couldn't help but wonder, why did Allah care more about a person's religious beliefs and their genitals when it came to women selecting a lifelong partner? Why couldn't the requirement for who I was allowed to marry come down to whether or not that person was a decent human being? In my late teenage years, I decided that I needed to restore my iman. It was finally time for me to become a good Muslim woman and to put my criticisms and questions to rest once and for all. To achieve this, of course, I consulted Allah's perfect message, His final word. So I read the Quran from cover to cover. Then I read it again, and each time I read it, the same things would jump out to me. Justifications for misogyny, justifications for homophobia, justifications for slavery, for violence, for a sick, disturbing obsession with disbelievers, the grueling and graphic descriptions of hell, how my skin would be roasted off in Jahannam, only to be rebuilt and roasted once again over and over for eternity, for the simple act of disbelieving. I think as a Muslim woman, it is much easier for us to read the Quran and recognize that there is something not right. For example, as women, the Quran explains that we are only to receive half the inheritance of what a man receives. We are expected to cover in order to prevent sexualization of our bodies from men. Now, not only is this sexist towards women, but it's also highly offensive towards men. To depict men as hypersexualized creatures incapable of controlling themselves in the presence of women is truly disturbing. This is a clear example of how rape culture is perpetuated. This is a clear example of victim blaming. As I continued to dive deeper into my studies of Islam, I began to consult the Hadith in great detail. This was a major tipping point for me. As anyone who has read the Hadith knows, there are some truly disturbing teachings in there. For example, a woman's testimony is considered to be worth half that of a man due to the deficiency of a woman's mind. We are considered fitna, a temptation, rather than a human being. There is a plethora of teachings advocating for the execution of apostates. The death penalty is, of course, also prescribed to people of the LGBTQ community if they are caught engaging in homosexual acts. Contained within the Hadith itself was also complete ludicrousy. For example, Muhammad advises us to drink camel piss because apparently that's good for you. He also had other interesting pieces of advice to offer, such as dunking flies in your tea, as one wing may in fact have the cure to disease. As I reflected back on my Muslim upbringing, I began to realize that I'd been heavily indoctrinated through mechanisms of fear. I was taught about the grueling, excruciating torture in the grave that I would experience if I was not a good Muslim believer. This is a very sick and twisted thing to teach a very young child. There also came a time where I had to confront the fact that there was a basic lack of evidence for some of the things taught to me within Islam. For example, I had wholeheartedly believed in the fact that Muhammad split the moon once upon a time and that this was considered a miracle. However, when I actually decided to research and assess this evidence for myself, I soon realized that there was no evidence for this at all. It wasn't long before I realized that the barbaric and inhumane teachings of Islam were still taking place and affecting the lives of millions of people in this day and age. In 2021, there are still 12 countries that can execute you legally simply because you apostatized from Islam. People are still being lashed, imprisoned, tortured, and even killed simply for belonging to the LGBTQ community. It is painstakingly obvious that we are dealing with a significant, blatant violation of human rights on a global scale being justified in the name of Islam. Because many ex-Muslims still reside in Muslim-majority countries that hand out these barbaric punishments, it is almost impossible for them to find an avenue to speak up freely. When ex-Muslims are not being imprisoned, tortured, and killed, we still face other forms of backlash. Many of us are ostracized from our own families, from our communities. We are disowned, we are cast aside, we are rejected, we are depicted as evil, we are dehumanized and degraded left, right, and center, and according to Islam, that is all perfectly acceptable. Now, if I'm being completely honest, I never really planned on getting involved with ex-Muslim activism in the way that I am today. It all started during the COVID-19 lockdown period. I found myself so incredibly bored that I ended up downloading an app I swore I would stay away from. TikTok. I don't really remember why I chose to do this, but one day I decided to look up the ex-Muslim hashtag on TikTok, and I was really heartbroken to find that there wasn't much there. So on a whim, I decided, hey, how about I post my own TikTok video and see what happens. I called it Things I Hear as an Ex-Muslim, and I was shocked when I soon realized that within a matter of minutes, the video had gone viral. It had accumulated nearly 40,000 views only a few minutes after I posted it. I really didn't understand how to process this. I certainly wasn't ready for that. But what surprised me more than anything was the amount of backlash coming from Muslims, the amount of hatred, the amount of violent threats and disturbing descriptions of what people wanted to do with me simply because I was identifying publicly as an ex-Muslim. This was one of the main things that pushed me to keep going. Seeing how desperately people wanted me to remain silent only encouraged me to speak up even louder. So I did. I kept making TikTok videos and I started sharing my voice on Twitter. It wasn't long before I was contacted by ex-Muslims all around the world who told me how inspired they were to see other people like them speaking up. And it made me think back to my own childhood when I saw myself as deficient, when I didn't know that it was possible to be an ex-Muslim, when I didn't know that it was okay to disbelieve. I thought back to when I didn't realize that it was perfectly normal and acceptable to want to think objectively, critically, and for yourself, as opposed to within the constraints of a 7th century ideology. I thought back to how lonely and scared I was in those days when I didn't realize that other ex-Muslims existed. I remembered what a huge relief it was when I finally started to discover other ex-Muslims. All of these people putting themselves out there, being the brave, courageous characters that they were and speaking up on behalf of those who couldn't do the same. And I decided, maybe that could be me. Maybe I could be that for someone else. Maybe I can empower people to be who they truly are. And maybe I can demonstrate to others that it is okay to leave Islam, that it is okay to be an ex-Muslim. So I decided to keep going, and eventually I landed here on YouTube. Today I look back and I remember all the people who have reached out to me from around the world, and it pushes me and encourages me to keep going. And so I've decided that I will not stop doing this until ex-Muslims around the world are no longer persecuted, ostracized, killed, imprisoned, tortured, simply for being who we are, simply for wanting to disbelieve in a barbaric ideology, simply for wanting to think freely, to love freely, to embrace our individuality. The normalization of religious dissent, particularly within the context of Islam, is crucial for the progression of our society, and that is why I am not going to stop.